Bonjour Georges Siemens.
Bonjour.
Tout d'abord, merci d'avoir accepté cette interview pour Educavox, qui sera diffusée grâce au concours de Sophie Touzé, ici présente, experte en open éducation. Vous êtes le théoricien du connectivisme, apprentissage dans une société basée sur les technologies numériques et en particulier qui utilise les réseaux comme point central de l'apprentissage. Vous venez d'intervenir aux journées de l'e-learning de Lyon sur les MOOCs et vous insistez sur le fait que les inscrits sont en grande majorité des diplômés de moins de 35 ans. Bien que le pourcentage des non-diplômés soit faible, ils représentent des milliers de personnes qui ont accès à des formations universitaires et des certifications. N'est-ce pas là une véritable révolution?
I think it is. I mean, the access to education, which has been a goal for educators for a long time. And even if you look back in the 1890s, where the first stages of correspondence or mail education started, it was about giving people an opportunity to learn, even if they might have some limitations personally, or they might have, geographically or otherwise. So access to education is really the first step. And what MOOCs represent in terms of a revolution, I would say yes, but I would qualify it and say that they represent a revolution in terms of access to education. What we do from there in terms of how we offer and how we deploy the MOOCs and how we support learners, and that's the part of the revolution that we haven't spent enough time on yet. But I would say just very briefly as a starting point, when a student in India or in Africa or in Latin America or whatever remote part of the world, when that student is able to access knowledge that he or she is interested in accessing and they don't have the barriers that they would have had even 10 years ago to get to that professor's lecture, that represents a real revolution.
Et pouvez-vous nous dire en quoi et comment les MOOCs sont reliés et peuvent aider l'open education?
I hope they're very strongly linked to open education, even though right now many of the large MOOC providers are not. So what needs to happen is, even currently, and this is a bit of a challenge with MOOCs, in that right now they duplicate the existing education system in many ways. There are opportunities for innovation that are not being taken advantage of. So one of the biggest areas is that when you take a MOOC, you have to take it as an entire course. It would be helpful if that course was broken down into different learning units and that those learning units were licensed openly for anyone to take and anyone to access. Then I think they could represent a real revolution, especially in the open education resources movement or the open courseware movement, where a teacher teaching here, let's say in Lyon, or a teacher teaching in Alberta or in the US would be able to take that one unit on statistics and include it with her other course notes, or that one unit in biology and be able to bring that in. So once the MOOC curriculum, the content of the MOOCs are made available and learners, or teachers I should say, can access specific sections of it rather than take an entire 4-week or an 8-week course of the MOOC, then I think it'll be significant. My concern around MOOCs is that they represent at some level an enclosure of education. And by enclosure, I mean that the curriculum being used by MOOCs can be closed off and controlled by an organization. What we've seen happen in the last decade with the open education resources movement is the exact opposite. We've seen more and more teachers and faculty sharing their lecture notes, sharing their videos on YouTube, their course notes on, for download through a PDF or a similar format, and that has made a big impact in our ability to access the content. My worry with MOOCs is that if they're not based on open courseware, that they'll become a closed space that actually is a regression from the progress made over the last decade.
La plupart des MOOCs sont en langue anglaise, il y en a peu en langue française. Quel rôle la France et le Canada peuvent jouer dans le monde des MOOCs selon vous?
Okay, so most of MOOCs are in English language. What can countries like France and Canada do have to an original place or identity in the world of MOOCs?
That is such an important question because this is something that was relevant even in the early stages of open education resources, which is that some individuals viewed them as a kind of a colonialism of education, because now content that is developed from, let's say, at MIT, the content developed there might reflect an American mindset, American values and philosophies. So in order to prevent that type of a hegemonic perspective of learning content with MOOCs, I think the most important thing that is needed is that those regions of the world that have different languages, different philosophies, different approaches or different worldviews begin developing their own MOOCs as well, or their own MOOC providers. So a system such as, let's say a university system like in France, what would be in my eyes a helpful thing for them to do is to create and develop their own MOOC platform, not just to move their content into a platform like Coursera. Even though Coursera has made a big impact, what I think is needed is more ideas, more approaches so that we better understand it. So advancing that perspective, when you have schools and universities, and look at some of the world-leading French universities in Quebec and Canada, we have some top leading universities that are French-speaking as well that have huge impact globally. For these universities to begin to collaborate with one another and advance a particular perspective or a French language approach would be, I think, very valuable. And French language speakers, they're the third largest language speaking population in the world. So I think it makes sense that attention is paid to that subset. On a much smaller level, there are regions of the world where you might just have a few million people speaking a particular language. One of the best ways to preserve that language as well is to have those regions develop and teach in their own language rather than just import and translate knowledge that's been developed in other parts of the world.
Thank you very much, Charles Siemens.
Thank you.
Merci.